My mom doesn't accept my choices, my husband, my kids, my family. I never imagined my life would turn out like this. 8 years of marriage, 3 beautiful children, and a husband who adores me. By all accounts, I should be living a fairy tale. But there's one shadow that looms over everything: my mother's hatred for my husband. It's a hatred that is so deep, so irrational, that it extends even to our innocent children. It's a burden I've carried for years, and it's one that has made my relationship with my parents more than just strained. It's practically non-existent. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when I first introduced my husband to my family. I'm not one to brag, but I know I'm considered quite beautiful by most people's standards. Growing up, my mother never let me forget that. She had high hopes for me, constantly reminding me that I needed to marry well. In her mind, well meant a wealthy businessman with the kind of financial security that would elevate our entire family. She had a grand vision of luxury homes, fancy cars, and endless shopping sprees, all provided by my future husband. But life had other plans. I fell in love with an ordinary guy. Let's call him Mark. He wasn't rich, didn't have a fancy job title, and he certainly didn't come from money. But he was kind, hard-working, and most importantly, he loved me for who I was, not for what I looked like or what I could bring him. He wasn't my mother's dream man, but he was mine. When I first told my parents about Mark, they were skeptical. My father, usually a man of few words, simply grunted and muttered something about missed opportunities. My mother, on the other hand, was livid. She couldn't believe that I, a woman she considered a prize, would settle for someone she deemed so beneath me. Despite their disapproval, I decided to bring Mark home to meet them, hoping they would see what I saw in him. The day was a disaster from the start. My mother made no effort to hide her disdain. The moment Mark stepped into our house, she looked him up and down as if he were something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of her shoe. She barely greeted him before launching into a barrage of pointed questions, each one more intrusive and dismissive than the last. Mark tried to remain polite, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. Then, in a moment that still haunts me, my mother kicked him out. "You're not good enough for my daughter," she spat. "I won't have this joke of a man in my home." I was mortified. As Mark walked out, I thought for sure that was the end of our relationship. I couldn't blame him if he never wanted to see me again after that humiliation. But to my surprise, the very next day, he proposed to me. He told me he loved me and that he didn't care what my mother thought. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. We talked for hours, discussing our future, our dreams, and the challenges we knew we'd face. Despite everything, I said yes. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I loved Mark, and I was willing to fight for us. We got married without my parents' blessing. The wedding was small, intimate, and perfect in its own way. But the absence of my family was a shadow over the day. My father didn't even show up, and my mother's absence spoke volumes. It was as if I had been disowned. The years that followed were a mix of happiness and struggle. Mark and I worked hard, eventually buying our own home, though we had to take on debt to do so. My parents, who had the means to help us, never offered a cent. My mother went so far as to tell me that she had already made her will, leaving everything to her sister and nephews. Whether she was serious or just trying to scare me, I didn't know, and frankly, I didn't care. We had learned to rely on ourselves, not on my parents. But what I couldn't understand, what still baffles me to this day, is how my mother's hatred extended to our children. How could a grandmother despise her own grandchildren simply because they were born to a man she didn't approve of? My relationship with my parents became more distant as the years went by. They rarely visited, and when they did, it was always strained. My mother never missed an opportunity to remind me of how I had ruined my life by marrying Mark. She would drop comments about how I could have been living in luxury if I had just listened to her, or how my children would have had a better future if I had married a real man. I learned to tune her out, but it was harder to ignore how she treated my children. From the moment they were born, she barely acknowledged them. There were no doting, grandmotherly visits, no gifts, no affection. It was as if they didn't exist. The few times she did see them, she was cold and distant, barely making eye contact. My father was no better, simply following my mother's lead. It broke my heart to see my children treated this way. They were innocent, and they didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this feud. Mark, to his credit, never said a bad word about my parents, even though I knew it hurt him too. He would just hold me and tell me that we didn't need them, that we were enough. But as my children grew older, they started to notice the way my parents treated them. My eldest, Sarah, was the first to ask about it. "Why doesn't Grandma like us?" she asked one day, her big brown eyes filled with confusion. I didn't know how to answer her. How do you explain to a child that their own grandmother doesn't like them because of who their father is? I tried to brush it off, telling her that Grandma was just busy, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She was too smart for her own good, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. Things came to a head one Christmas. We had decided to host the family gathering at our home, hoping to bridge the gap with my parents. We went all out, decorations, a big tree, and a feast that took days to prepare. I was nervous but hopeful that this would be the start of a new chapter. When my parents arrived, I could see the tension in my mother's face. She barely acknowledged Mark and the kids, instead focusing her attention on criticizing the decorations, the food, even the way I had set the table. I bit my tongue, trying to keep the peace. But the breaking point came when it was time to open presents. My mother had brought a few gifts, but they were clearly afterthoughts. Generic, impersonal items that looked like they had been picked up last minute. My children, who were too young to understand the subtext, thanked her politely, but I could see the disappointment in their eyes. Then, without warning, my mother announced that she was leaving. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't what Christmas is supposed to be." I was stunned. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This," she gestured around the room, "isn't a real family. This isn't what I wanted for you." The room fell silent. I could feel Mark tensing beside me, and my children looked on in confusion. I could have let it go, could have let her walk out without saying anything, but I couldn't hold back any longer. "Mum, if you can't accept my family, then maybe you shouldn't come around anymore," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "I love Mark, and I love our children. If you can't see that, then maybe it's best if we take a break from each other." My mother looked at me as if I had slapped her. Without another word, she turned and walked out, my father following behind her. That was the last time I saw them. They didn't call, didn't write, and I didn't reach out either. I was done trying to win their approval. Life after cutting ties with my parents was strangely liberating. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about their disapproval or their hurtful comments. Our home was filled with peace, and my children blossomed in the absence of their toxic influence. Mark and I grew closer, our bond strengthening as we navigated this new chapter together. But even as I found solace in our little family unit, there was still a part of me that grieved for the relationship I had lost. Not with my parents, but with the idea of what could have been, of what our family could have looked like if my parents had been different. One day, as I was reflecting on all of this, I received an unexpected phone call from my father-in-law. He and my mother-in-law lived in a small town a few hours away, and while they didn't have much in terms of wealth, they had always been kind and supportive. "We'd like to visit," he said, his voice warm. "We miss you all, and we thought it was time we spent some time together." I was surprised, but touched. "Of course," I replied. "We'd love to have you." The visit was exactly what I needed. My in-laws arrived with smiles, hugs, and a car full of homemade goodies. They doted on the kids, playing games with them, telling them stories, and generally making them feel loved and valued. It was everything I had ever wanted from my own parents, but had never received. As the weekend went on, I realized that my in-laws had become the family I had always hoped for. They weren't wealthy, but they were rich in love, and that was worth more than any amount of money. They didn't care about status or appearances. They cared about us, about our happiness. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, my father-in-law turned to me with a serious expression. "We know things haven't been easy for you," he said gently. "We just want you to know that we're here for you, for all of you." I felt a lump in my throat as I nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you," I whispered. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the family I had lost and the family I had gained. My parents might never change, might never accept Mark or our children, but that didn't mean I was alone. I had Mark, I had our beautiful children, and I had in-laws who loved us unconditionally. I knew then that I had made the right decision. I had chosen love, and that was worth more than any inheritance or approval. Just as life was starting to settle into a comfortable routine, something happened that I never could have predicted. It started with a phone call, a call from a lawyer. "Mrs. Stevens," the voice on the other end of the line said, "I'm calling regarding your parents' estate." My heart skipped a beat. "What about it?" I asked cautiously. "There's been a change in the will," the lawyer explained. "Your mother has passed away, and as her executor, it's my duty to inform you that she has left you a significant portion of her estate." I was stunned. "But she always said she was leaving everything to her sister and nephews." "Yes, well, it seems she changed her mind," the lawyer replied. "She left a letter explaining her decision. I think it would be best if you came to my office to read it." A whirlwind of emotions hit me. Shock, confusion, even a tinge of sadness. Despite everything, I never expected this. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, he handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a letter, written in my mother's familiar handwriting. "Dear Sarah," it began. "I know you never expected this, neither did I, if I'm being honest. But as I got older, I started to realize something that I was too stubborn to see before. You were right. You chose love, and I was too blind to see its value. I spent so many years angry at you for not living up to my expectations, but in the end, I was the one who failed you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I hurt you and your family, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. But I want you to know that I did love you, even if I didn't show it in the right way. I've left you this inheritance, not as a way to make up for the past, but as a way to give you the future you deserve. I hope you can use it to build the life you've always wanted, with the man you love and the children you cherish. Love, Mum Tears. Welled up in my eyes as I finished reading the letter. For years, I had believed that my mother hated me, that she despised the life I had built. But in the end, she had seen the truth. She had realized that love was more important than wealth, status, or appearances. The inheritance was substantial, enough to pay off our debts and secure our future. But more than that, it was a symbol of my mother's final act of love, a recognition of the choices I had made and the family I had created. With the inheritance, Mark and I were able to pay off our mortgage and set aside a college fund for our children. It was a relief to be free from debt, to know that we could provide for our family without worrying about money. But the true gift was the peace of mind that came with knowing my mother had finally accepted my choices. As life went on, our family grew closer. My in-laws remained a constant source of support, and we made it a point to spend as much time with them as possible. My children thrived in the loving environment we had created, and they never lacked for anything, especially not love. One day, as I watched my children playing in the yard, I thought about everything we had been through. The struggles, the heartache, the tension with my parents. It had all been worth it in the end. I had chosen a life filled with love, and that was something no amount of money could buy. And in the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all.